So some very interesting drone stuff this week. First of all, Monday was the day that the highly anticipated small UAS drone rules from the FAA came out, the commercial drone rules. Prior to the rules enacted this week, you had to get specific permission from the FAA to use a drone for commercial purposes, and a limited number of people have gotten such permission. Now it's still a process, and it seems like it's going to be quite a complicated process to navigate if what you want to do is use a drone commercially. But at least there is an avenue for you to get to be able to do that. There is a test that you have to have. There's a pilot certificate that you have to obtain, and you have to register your drone if it is over half a pound in weight and less than 55 pounds. If it's over 55 pounds, I'm not sure exactly what category you fall into then. First of all, I'm not even sure how you get it airborne or how it's not got some sort of military application. But assuming that you are actually using an enormous 55-pound plus drone, I think the FAA does have some mechanisms or guidelines for you to follow, a whole different category to go through there. But since most drones are between half a pound and 55 pounds, that's where you're going to find yourself. And there are a lot of devils in these details. The test itself is really hard. Certainly, you can pass it, but it is somewhere harder than a driver's license, not as hard as a pilot's license, but somewhere in between. Lots of things to know in order to get that certificate. And one of the kickers is, even when you've gotten it, unless you get an exemption from the FAA, and they will consider some exemptions on a case-by-case basis, you have to keep that drone in sight. You have to have line of sight control of it. So these are all very interesting requirements. But Margot, I'm guessing from some of the writing you've done watching these new rules take effect, that in some ways you don't think they go far enough. Can you tell us why?
Sure. So there's been this ongoing battle about privacy, and I think there's some context that's useful for this. The FAA said way back when that it didn't have any interest in doing any kind of privacy regulations. It wanted to only address safety issues. And so as the process of enacting, or I guess issuing regulations make it easier for people to use drones or use small drones, that lowering of cost of drone use means it's more likely that you're going to have wider spread privacy violations. And I don't belong to the camp of people who think that this is the FAA's purview, that the agency that's responsible for safety in the sky needs to also be responsible for privacy. But the issue is that there's a pretty significant regulatory gap there, and there doesn't seem to be any other actor that's really stepping in. So you had attempts at the, this is going to be like acronym soup, the NTIA, which is at the Department of Commerce, held a multi-stakeholder negotiation where there were voluntary best practices put forth in May that are voluntary things commercial drone users can do to try not to invade people's privacy. But of course, the big issue there is those are all voluntary. And then I've also been watching as individual states have enacted drone privacy laws ranging from the absolutely ridiculous to the maybe kind of functional. So I guess the sort of interesting development on the FAA side is we've now lowered the hurdles for deciding that you're going to go commercially fly drones without putting in any kind of floor of privacy protection.
Right. So for all of you who've been waiting for these commercial drone rules, or sort of holding your breath to know that they were going into effect, and expecting your packages to arrive or your food to arrive via drone, that's probably not going to happen anytime soon because of this line of sight requirement. Hard to have packages and long range deliveries happening that way. I don't know that the technology is actually there to be able to let that happen as well. Although we've got some really interesting stories in the discussion points about various ways that drones are being used, things that might be done with them in the future. But the DJI Phantom, one of the most expensive, if you're a commercial videographer, you're likely to be using this thing. It has about a 2-mile range. So again, keeping that in line of sight is probably not terribly easy. It better be a clear day and you better have really sharp eyes. But it's going to be required if that's what, if you're operating under the new drone rules. Any thoughts on the new rules themselves, Mike, before we move into this sensitivity about the lack of privacy regulation on them?
But actually, I did have a question for Margot that kind of ties into the next subject. Given that you mentioned that the FAA has decided not to engage in any sort of regulatory oversight with respect to privacy, and no other federal agency is stepping in, does that mean that we're left for state laws to kick in? And if so, are we potentially running into a potential problem here with conflict between somebody that's complying with FAA guidelines with respect to drone usage and privacy regulation under a state law regime?
The answer is yes. And the FAA has actually said that I think it said that the licensing process itself will involve some form of privacy education. And part of that privacy education is supposed to be to point to drone operators that they're still operating in a heavily regulated realm in some states. In other words, in human language, check your local privacy laws, your state privacy laws before you go out and fly this thing. Because it actually turns out in a number of states, you cannot use it to record people or private property. Whether I think that's a good idea, again, I think is a different conversation. But yes, you're right. There's this sort of federalist overlay of regulation on top of your ability to just get a license from the FAA to fly it.
Right, and there are some non-intuitive things in the drone rules, the federal drone rules themselves, and I'm sure, as Margot points out, that there's even more confusion when you start putting in even more strict state and local requirements that may also be in effect. But even in the federal rules themselves, there's a requirement that unless you have an exemption, you're not allowed to fly over groups of people. That's something that's kind of difficult if what you're doing is a videographer for weddings, for example, or independent filmmaking, things like that. So it does seem like you need to look at the fine print and really hone in on what it is you want to be doing commercially with your drone, and make sure that just taking the test and getting the certificate and registering your drone is sufficient. It might not be. So definitely pay attention to all of that if you've decided that this is your next career move.
Denise,
sorry, go ahead. Yes.
Another question that it wasn't clear to me it relates to the issue on the line of sight requirement.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in one sense, it seems like, well, this could be of limited use because, how far can you really see? But can you use like binoculars or some other sort of enhancement to make sure that something is still in the line of sight and you could see it, potentially dozens, if not even more miles away than that? Do the regulations speak to anything like that, Margot, or does it simply have to be with the naked eye or somebody wearing glasses?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that the regs say that it has to be without any kind of enhancement. What's interesting is, so even though I was talking about the fact that the costs of operating a drone are lowered by these regs, because you used to have to go through this whole crazy process if you were a commercial operator of getting a waiver through the 333 exemption process. And now it's easier to do this than it is to do 333. But there are still, as Denise points out, significant restrictions. So visual line of sight means it's still relatively high cost. You can't get out of line of sight. Even just requiring people to go get a license, whether the license is hard or not, you're requiring somebody to get off their chair and go walk someplace and get a license, it's going to restrict the number of people who end up using these commercially. So the privacy alarmist in me is, only slightly alarmed and not fully alarmed given the restrictions that are in place.